I'm 88. I still cannot explain why I walked away from that place when so many did not. I tell you that up front because I have lived under that question for most of my life. It follows me into quiet rooms and wakes me in the night like a draft. Sometimes I can wrap it in numbers and maps, say it was luck or chance, point to supply lines and blown bridges. Other times I look at the sky, and all I can say is what I felt. Something white stood between me and whatever was meant to take us that morning. I don't know what to call it. I only know how it felt. If you want to hear the whole memory, stay with me and subscribe. It matters to me that it is recorded, that someone else hears it while I still can tell it in my own voice. The date is stubborn. It wants to be exact. December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes winter has a way of engraving itself thin light, the kind that doesn't warm, and a cold that sits in your bones like a promise it won't let go. I was 19 that winter. We had been moving north and east, and then nowhere fast. The roads were a mess, clogged with men and machines that could not keep pace with the orders they were given. All of us felt the weight of it, but nothing weighs the way fuel does. War, I learned then, is not only men against men. It runs on metal and flame, on gallons poured into iron mouths, on men who bring it forward under any sky. We were somewhere near Hansfeld, at weak little towns that blurred together after nights without sleep. You could point at a name on a map, and the smell would come back. Diesel, stale smoke, the iron tongue of cold breath in your face. Jerry cans lined the sides of roads like soldiers on parade stained, dented, each one a promise or a lie. The Germans had taken stores, found caches. They moved like predators, and their logistics were effective where ours were not. It was an inversion that kept hitting us, an enemy making use of the very thing that should have starved them. For us, a tank without fuel was a coffin waiting to be filled. For them, a captured fuel dump could be a feast. Those are the flat facts. I learned them and taught them myself later when I tried to explain the day to doctors and grandchildren and strangers. It helps to tell the why when you are asked why you lived. It does not answer the part that kept me awake, the part I could not measure. The convoy crawled at first, then stopped. Engines coughed and went quiet like a choir that had been told to hush. It was before dawn. The ground had a crust of ice. It broke under your boots with thin, brittle sound. We parked where we could. Men hunched close to heaters that barely worked, cupping hands that still trembled against the cold. I remember the sound of packs settling, the rattle of loose metal, the occasional curse when someone found a strap had frozen. Lights winked in the distance other columns, other soldiers, and at times it felt like the whole world had folded back on itself into a narrow lane of breath and metal. We were low. The word meant everything. Low meant rationed strings of fuel, the hope that the next truck would come, the terror of watching the needle dip and stay near empty. We checked cans like a man checks his pulse. The tanks cupped by the road looked monumental and fragile at once, hulks of promise that would not move without liquid life. I handled a jerrycan once. It was warm from someone else's hands, dented where a cartridge had hit it earlier, or a tree had struck it in a rough maneuver. The cap was sticky with grime. I remember the way the smell rose from it, thick and oily, and how for a moment it smelled like home, like the garden shed where my father kept his tools. Strange how war twists memory. Orders moved through the ranks like a rumor. Pipelines and supply plans have names that mean nothing when you are 19 and your boots are wet. But we were told enough to know the stakes. Hold the line where you can. Get to the refueling point. Stay off the open ground in daylight. It was a matter of inches, and inches meant life. I clung to instructions like a lifeline. They were small commands that felt huge. Don't stop on the bridge, move light, keep the headlights low. They had the tone of people who had measured losses and tried to make them stop. By dawn, the columns were jammed. Engines that had been running in fits and starts now sputtered and sat in silence. Men got out and walked along the flanks of the vehicles, hands in pockets, blowing on them until fingers reddened. I remember the quiet that sits on a column of stalled machines, no triumphant music, no fanfare, only the low, betrayed weight of metal waiting for fuel. The radio hissed with broken chatter. Someone whispered about a depot at Hansfeld, about a German unit that had misjudged its position, about how a single captured reserve could shift an entire local campaign. The talk carried the hum of a desperate hope. We were not a parade. We were exhausted, cold, and dirty. The boys I had been with were not boys by any measure that matters. They were tired men who had learned quick the contours of fear and the small, thin graces that kept you breathing. We moved like ghosts among iron, checking each other's boots for ice, passing a can that might have another cup of fuel. The engines around us had that litany of small complaints. A cough, a tired chuff, the silence where a piston had chosen to rest. I had been a loader on a tank then. In the cramped belly of the machine, everything is too close. The world becomes the circumference of a hatch. You count the rounds and the breaths. There is no room for poetic thoughts. There is room only for tasks and for the sudden, crude mathematics of survival. You learn to read a man's face in the space of a second and know if he will hold when it comes down to it. We had all seen enough to know what it meant when a machine wouldn't move. Around us, the battlefield felt more industrial than heroic. It was racks and reservations, inventories and routes. I had been taught to respect those things, to listen when a quartermaster spoke. Even so, there was something obscene about the way the war was managed. Lines on paper that decided whether a unit could breathe or would suffocate. I thought then that the machinery of war was more powerful than prayer. I thought practicality had the last word. Then the panic started to stitch itself into the morning like a spreading stain. Reports came in clipped and shallow. Enemy to the east. Movement near the crossroad. Artillery zeroed in on the northern approach. Words that are meant to be informative clipped like bullets in our ears. It didn't take long for the sense of being watched to grow into the sense of being circled. Short sentences now. Engines died. Men whispered. The wind cut like metal. We were sitting ducks on a snarl of road. The anti-aircraft tracers began to stitch the sky. A few rounds slapped into the earth nearby and made the ground jump. Men shoved each other into ditches when shells came in. Like a bad routine we were tired of performing. We abandoned vehicles in the worst of it, no ceremony, no chance to return. The order was implicit. Get out, keep your life, leave the rest. A tank will sit for weeks. A man cannot. I have a clear memory of stepping out onto frozen mud and looking back at our track. It wasn't the tank's roar I remember then. It was the smell. Burnt oil, hot metal, and a sweetness disturbing, almost floral, that came from fuel shaken loose and ignited. Not far away, I could see a black plume, a ribbon of smoke rising and swallowing the weak morning light. Someone said later it was a depot crushed by an artillery shell. Later, we would learn that dozens of vehicles were left where they sat, rows of hulks in the snow like broken statues. At the time, we only had the immediacy of danger cold and sound and the small, urgent business of keeping warm and breathing. We were out of fuel. The words out of fuel are simple and precise, and they mean collapse when you are in a mechanized war. Out of fuel meant your gun could not tilt, your turret could not rotate if the track got jammed, your radio would die, your only heat a pair of human bodies pressed together. We tried to keep the line. We tried to move. We were hampered by the very thing we needed. The men around me moved with a peculiar combination of rigid efficiency and raw fear. Orders were mute sometimes. Points of light from officers' cigarettes were the only beacons. A dozen times that morning, I thought the shelling would finish it. The earth shook in a way that left the bones too raw to name. When artillery comes close, it sounds like the world is being rearranged. It thins you out. There is no room for thought beyond the instantaneous task. There is only reaction: get down, run, find cover, hold on. We did it. We did the things we'd been trained to do. We felt very small. And that is when the thing I have tried to describe my whole life began. It did not announce itself with trumpets or thunder. It did not arrive on a choir of voices. It was, at first, a change in the air. It is the strangest thing to say. The cold stopped biting in a circle around me. That was the first signal. Imagine a blanket set down gently, without noise, over freezing hands. The wind did not reach me the same way. The small, grinding sound of the convoy far off smoothed, as if someone had turned down the world's volume. My breath in the air did not fog like everyone else's. The light shifted. Not brighter, exactly different. Softer, but sharp at the edges. I cannot tell you if the light had a color in a way a painter would describe. To me, it was white. It hung where it needed to be, like a cloth draped without touching. I have said white because that is what the memory gives me. Call it a glow if you like. Call it a presence. I do not know. I only know that when that white was there, the shells that had been falling with cruel competence stopped falling, where we were standing. The pings and booms kept happening around us trees, and broken fences took their share. But the immediate arc that had been coming our way diverted or did not arrive at all. Men around me were still shouting, moving, noticing nothing different. Only I had the sense of a shield laid over a very small space. Do not take my words to mean I was untouched. I was not in a protective bubble where everything ceased. I remember the smell of powder, the heat of an engine, the weight of a man's hand on my shoulder. I remember the sound of someone sobbing softly behind a tarp. The world continued. And yet, in the center of that storm, something was altered. My hair does not stand on end with a piousness I do not feel. I kept thinking in practical terms. Did someone order the artillery to shift? Did the enemy miscalculate? Was it luck? Was it some error in trajectory? All plausible. All of them make sense to a rational mind. None of them satisfies the way the sensation did. The white figure, if you will let me name it but for ease, was not a statue. It had the sense of movement, a shape outlined by absence as much as by anything solid. I could make out the suggestion of something upright, an impression more than a form. It did not speak. It did not gesture in any language I knew. It simply seemed to be there, like a pivot for the world to turn around for a moment. The noises that had been jagged became rounded. The immediate threat slid past, and we lived in a pocket of impossibly calm air. I know how this sounds. I have heard every reaction you could imagine. You were deluded, some say now. You misremembered, others tell me kindly. I would rather hear that than the opposite, that I pretended to myself because I could not bear the horror. The hardest thing for me has been keeping the account honest to what my senses recorded. I do not claim miraculous immunity. I cannot catalog microphysics. I can only tell you the order of events as I felt them. When the sensation ended, it was like someone removing a hand from a stove. There was a subtle release, no fanfare, no thunderclap. The shells continued to fall. The men resumed their movements. We left the vehicle. We abandoned the tank because it was useless without fuel, and because the priority by then was to get as many bodies together as possible. I still remember the look of the tracks drying in the slush as we moved away, the way a printed map might show a scrawl where something catastrophic had been. We walked away with the pale light behind us and the sound of burning fuel behind that. There was a burning depot not far away later in the day. We watched black pillars of fire bend and readjust the air. Cars and trucks were columns in the snow, half mingled, blackening. The sight of bright flame against the dull sky is a picture that never leaves you. It is both magnificent and obscene. Later we would learn how fuel had been captured, how some stockpiles had been turned to the enemy's use, how holes in supply lines turned campaigns on their heads. We would learn how many tanks were abandoned, how many men were left to freeze, because the one resource that made a machine useful fuel had been managed, seized, or destroyed. War is arithmetic, and it kills on margins. Yet here is the small, stubborn fact. I left that place alive. I left while others did not. I have carried their faces. I have carried the question of why. The white presence, whatever it was, does not answer for those who did not get the same grace. It makes the weight heavier in one way. The survivor's burden is not only to live, but to explain why. After the morning, we kept moving when we could. We found groups of other soldiers, walkers, and drivers patching together something that resembled a plan. We used what we could scavenge, traded what we had, covered wounded as best we could with blankets and prayer, if prayer is the right word. We carried the dead. We saw scenes I will not slow down to tell now, because they are a compendium of small cruelties. A body half buried in snow, a man with his eyes frozen open, the hush of a town emptied except for smoke. I don't tell those stories for shock. I tell them to mark the scale of what survival asks of you. Memory. There were days after that where I walked and thought the ground had a new weight. People who have not been in battle use haunted casually. The word fits. I dreamed sometimes in black and white, like old newsreels, and woke with my mouth tasting like diesel. I learned to lay down my boots and sleep when sleep came, because the past would always be near otherwise. I learned, too, that testimony is a tricky thing. If you say you were privileged by a presence, people will want to put it into categories for you. I resisted that for a long time. I told the story in fragments to a priest once, and to my wife many times. Each telling shifted a little, not because the facts changed, but because memory is a living thing. There is survivor's guilt, of course. It sits in the hollow between your ribs sometimes, a stone you cannot dislodge. You ask yourself simple, terrible questions. Why me? Why not others? Why that patch of ground, and not the next? You walk through the years and try to give meaning to the absence left by friends who did not come home. I cannot say I have guilt in the sense of blame. Rather, it is a company of griefs that follow me. They make me speak now. The urgency to say what happened increases each year, as if testimony is an antidote to forgetting. I have spent decades puzzled by the intersection of measurement and mystery. I return to maps and logs later in life, not obsessively, but often enough to try and ground what I felt. The historians say the Ardennes was a matter of logistics as much as of courage. They speak of fuel convoys, miscalculated intelligence, the way a single seizure of supplies can ripple through an army. All true. And yet the human kernel of that history is not only lines and dates. It is a boy smelling a jerry can, a man watching flames lick the sky, a soldier who felt a presence and could not fit it into the ledger. When I talk about what happened, I am careful to separate the things we can corroborate from the private sensations that belong to me alone. I will say Hansfeld, and the date, and the sight of burning depots, because those are anchors anyone can look up. I will not insist that the white figure is an angel, or a miracle, in a way that demands you accept it as doctrine. I am not making a sermon. I am making an admission. I believe that something kept me that morning. That belief is not proof. It is an answer that sits in the space between faith and fact for me. There was another layer to the aftermath, a nearly practical one. The army makes use of what it can, and a man with a story is sometimes redirected into paperwork. I offered testimony later to officers who toured the battlegrounds, to chaplains who wanted to know how a man made sense of death. The official interest rarely lingered on the white thing. They took inventory. They measured losses. They asked if we had forgotten any equipment. History, in its administrative way, wanted receipts. The memory I carried did not come with receipts. As the war tapered into years, and the years into a lifetime, I learned another strange fact about memory. The more I tried to compartmentalize the morning into a neat box, danger, white presence, escape, the more it leaked out in private ways. I would be frying eggs with the kitchen window open, and suddenly the sound of a nearby explosion would fold the world into memory like a stamp. I would find myself tracing the rim of a coffee mug, and remember the rim of a hatch. The white figure would sometimes bloom in my mind uninvited, not as a miracle to be celebrated, but as a small, private economy of relief that I could not account for. I also found that telling the story changed me. When I spoke about the morning in public, it was as if the memory lost some of its sharpness, but gained a kind of public contour. People would come up and say, "Thank you for serving," or "My grandfather was there too," or sometimes, "I had something like that happen to me once." There is a community among people who carry unexplainable moments. We do not have a manifesto. We pass on our stories like small bones. There are others who would offer rationales, an adjustment in artillery aim, sky-guided errors, flukes of weather. All plausible. All I can say is that none of those explanations captured the internal experience, the way the air changed, the sensation of calm, the way the world seemed to tilt for a breath. I have tried to listen to experts and historians and to let their knowledge inform me. I continue to do so. Yet some things remain stubbornly personal. I have been asked why I waited to tell it so plainly. Part of it was time. You do not always find the words in a field hospital or on a troop transport. Part of it was privacy. Not every truth is a headline. Part of it was worry about being made small by other people's disbelief. Mostly, though, I waited because the thing that happened felt sacred in a domestic, ordinary way. I did not want to cheapen it. There is a dignity to an unannounced mercy that I wanted to protect. Even now, decades later, the memory can be precise in moments and foggy in others. I can point to the image of jerry cans like soldiers, the smell of diesel that tasted like something else. And I can point to the odd clarity of that white light and say, I felt guarded. My language feels inadequate, which is why I prefer to tell what I can and leave the rest as a question. I do not have the vocabulary to make it theological, nor the arrogance to demand belief from someone else. I offer the account because it has been my company. There are practicalities to survival that some will want to hear next. Where we went from Hansfeld, how we linked up with other units, how many of us made it back to the rear lines. There are names I could give captains and sergeants who ordered moves that saved lives, engineers who worked without sleep to resurrect a truck long enough for a convoy, and there are maps that mark the larger strategic consequences of those days. Those details matter because they make the story belong to history and not only to an internal miracle. But before we move on to maps and movements, there is a human moment I cannot skip. It was mid-morning when we were on the move, and a young private no older than 20 turned and looked at me as if he had been asked the simplest question in the world and could not answer. His face had the light from a cigarette behind it, the features smudged by cold. He spoke without ceremony. He asked, "Do you think it was God?" He said it the way a man asks about weather. I remember stopping and looking at him. I didn't want to answer in a way that would injure him or close a door. I told him I did not know. I told him that I believed something kept me that morning. He nodded, not satisfied, not dismissive. We kept walking. That exchange has been with me more than any other. It is the practical question. Did the presence mean anything beyond the moment? And the practical answer: sometimes a life survives for reasons we'll never count. That conversation is part of why I tell the story now. The years have blurred arguments into pathways. What remains are tiny moral obligations to those who walked and those who didn't. If a man has to die for something to be meaningful, then we have lost whatever humanity was left in the counting. I tell the story to shoulder that weight, to keep the names spoken and unspoken from dissolving into a sterile report. Memory, when you get to my age, feels like a trust. So I will proceed, but there is more to say, and I must choose carefully. There are moments of mechanical detail orders, the way men maneuvered tanks without fuel, the way we salvaged hoses and straps. There are also the inner clocks of men noticing small mercies, a piece of bread found in a pack, a laugh over something so absurd its humor is a medicine. I will not neglect the wider picture, the fact that dozens of men were abandoned in vehicles, the fact that a depot burned and changed operations for many days, the way fuel determined campaigns. Those are the things historians will nod over. They are also the scaffolding against which the white figure sits, an unaccounted variable in a ledger that otherwise makes sense. I want to take you back, though, not to the ledger, but to a single minute, a breath, where the practical and the unexplainable met. I want to describe for you, carefully, the way the air felt just before the presence, the precise sound that preceded it. I want you to see not only the wide shapes of supply and demand, but the small domestic facts, the condensation on a helmet rim, the way a man's thumb could find the shiver in another's hand and press for warmth. These are the scenes that make the miracle, if miracle you choose to call it, tangible. That minute begins with a whistle of wind. It begins with the way a shell's impact made a vapor of mud, the smell of spent powder, the pinch of cold in the throat that makes breathing a deliberate act. In that minute, you are acutely alive. You can feel the details like teeth on a comb. And then something else arrives, not as spectacle, but as shift. The world narrows. The white is not blinding. It is clarifying. It is as if the morning had been overcast, and someone had lifted the cloud enough to let the shapes take on meaning. I will tell you how the ground felt underfoot, how the men moved, the precise way the air seemed to separate. I will tell you why I cannot prove to anyone what I say, and why I insist on saying it anyway. I intend to be honest about doubt and honest about gratitude. There are costs to both. I will tell you of the face of a young man who did not live to see his 40th birthday, and the notes of orders that moved a column away from a road that became a death trap for others. I will tell you why the burning depot later that day felt like a punctuation to the long sentence of the morning. But I am stopping here for a breath. There is a moment coming when the shape draws closer in my memory, when I can place its edge near enough to feel the texture of it. It is the moment where the story compresses into either miracle or misremembering, depending on the ears you offer it to. For me, it remains the most honest center, unadorned, unproven, undeniable in its effect on my life. I will tell you what happened next, how I moved, who I met, the faces I could not erase. I will tell you the small arithmetic of survival, how some men traded places and lost, how some decisions were made without ceremony and with terrible consequence. I will tell you what I felt in the hours and days that followed, and how it shaped the man I became. But for now, hold with me the image of the morning before the white appeared, the jerry cans lined like patient witnesses, the stalled engines like sleeping beasts, the cold that bites with a faithful cruelty, the smell of fuel and earth intermingled. Hold that, because it is the setting into which something unmeasured slipped. It was not an event that could be booked in a register. It was a private interruption. In the next few minutes, if you stay, I will bring you to the edge of that interruption, to the point where the world tilted in a way that left me standing and changed everything. I would think about fate and care thereafter. The shape came closer in the way memory will let a thing approach, not as a measured arrival, but as a compression of sense. One moment I was counting breath and boots, and the next the world had a new margin. The air that had been bright with cold gathered itself around me, and something else sat in that small ring, as if it had been waiting to be noticed. I can still feel how ordinary my hands were. In the tank, they had been calloused and small. Outside, they were red from the cold and curled around a length of rope until my knuckles whitened. I remember the odd domestic detail, a threadbare glove, the way its wool came loose at the thumb. The white was not dramatic in the way a movie would make it. It did not explode into view. It settled, like smoke flattening into a quiet pool. When I say it was a figure, I mean there was a sense of vertical presence, something that had an axis and a suggestion of shoulders. But that is the limit of my description. It had no face that I could name. It had a boundary that I could sense. At first, I thought I had been singled out by luck. I thought perhaps I had stepped just slightly aside from the line of fire. Then a shell struck a bare tree, not 10 yards away, and threw twigs like a shower over the men closest to me. There was a clean failure in the pattern that had been targeting us. Fragments scorched other lines, and we were not touched in that tiny circle. The men moved. I moved. One of the boys, Tom, I think his name was, though I wish I could give you all the names without fumbling, shouted something that might have been a laugh, and then realized it was a sob. He looked past me, and he looked at nothing. He did not see what I saw. He saw a road and smoke and survival. I saw a white margin. I do not mean to suggest that the presence stopped the war or rewired ballistics. Shells still found soft ground, and the distant earth still answered in groans. People nearby were hit. That is the part that makes me most careful with my words. A man across from me stepped back, and his legs sagged in a way that made no sense, until someone tugged at the cloth and showed a wound. We dressed him as best we could, and later carried him. The white did not make the scene neat. It made the part around it different in degree, not in kind. There was a sensation of pressure, like a hand laid across your chest, that supplied a steadying force. The cold dulled in that ring. You could feel the difference in your breath. The little noises, metal scraping, a radio's brief crackle smooth into a lower register. My mind, so used to tallying things, wondered about practical causes. Was it sheltering in the curl of a ridge? Had the weather made a temporary pocket? Could a lucky trajectory have spared the spot where I stood? All were rational possibilities. None of them fully matched the precise, instant clarity that accompanied the sensation. A memory of touch intrudes as clear as any sound. The fabric of whatever the presence was felt like linen to me, if I had to give it a texture. That is a poor description. It is an attempt to translate a sensation into objects my life has known. It moved with a slight suggestion of motion, an almost imperceptible pivot that seemed to direct the world away from a small cluster of men. If it had been a person, it offered no voice, no glance, no gesture we could read. It simply existed in the way an island exists in a flood, without explaining the flood itself. Then the moment thinned and went. It was not a sudden snap, more like a hand smoothly withdrawn. The world returned to the same volume of sound and the same raw fear. Men exhaled as if they had been holding their breath. The private sense of relief I felt was matched by devastating reminders. A body under a tarp that had not twitched. A young face turned wrong in the snow. A neighbor's boot still clenched around a small pebble of mud. Leave-taking from that field felt obscene because it was ordinary. We moved away, and nothing announced the reason for our survival. We abandoned machines by the dozen that day. Engines were left to freeze and rust. Tracks sunk into the thawing snow. The convoy dwindled into smaller groups of walkers and patched-together vehicles, pulled together by greasy hands. At one point, an officer barked orders, and a sergeant rolled out a map on the hood of an abandoned truck, placing his cigarette ember against a piece of canvas and tracing a route with a finger that trembled. There was no ceremony. Plans were sullen and urgent. We marched in bands, mostly on foot, sometimes hitching a ride in a truck that had a wire along the back so we could hold on. Food came in fits. A crust of bread passed from man to man. A tin of bully beef shared with someone who had already had his ration that week. Conversation was scarce and carried the rawness of the immediate where-to-find fuel. Which unit nearest could spare a drink? Who had seen a field hospital? In the lull between reports, memories fluttered up like moths. The hair of a boy who had laughed in the dark. The tremor of a captain's voice when he told a crude joke to keep the men moving. We crossed a road where the asphalt had buckled from heat, blackened and curling like ribbon. Nearby, the flames from the depot had been subdued to dull embers by afternoon, but their work was done. The air carried a sweetness that clung to mouths and clogged throats. Trucks were parked at odd angles. Cargo spilled into the snow like a child's toys scattered by a tantrum. The scale of material loss was one of those things that lodges in your chest. Tanks abandoned for want of gas. A column of trucks left to melt into the roadside. Canisters open and half empty like small graves. We found shelter, then what counted as shelter. A farmhouse that had not been burned offered an attic where 7 of us squeezed in and traded places. The woman who owned the house had eyes like a map of the war, lines and endless, tiny naming of loss. She never spoke of reasons, only offered bread and a blanket and a look that said, "I have seen worse." That look is something that never quite washes away. You see it in the survivor at a cemetery, and you know instantly that grief is a common currency. When we finally made it back to a gathering point closer to the rear, I was given an official form to fill out and a cup of coffee that tasted like an invention. They asked the standard questions. They asked about equipment, times, coordinates, whether anyone had seen anything that might have explained an odd trajectory of artillery. I answered as best I could. I wrote down facts. On the form, there was no space for circles of light. There were only checkboxes and numbers. The people who listened politely to my insistence on the white presence occasionally smiled the way people do when they handle the unlikely. Some shrugged. A chaplain asked me once if I had taken communion. Another officer suggested fatigue might explain it. I did not pursue disagreements. I had the feeling, odd and stubborn, that argument could not diminish the face of the boy who did not come home. Years later, I took to tracing the route we had walked across maps. I learned to read the blotches that denote towns and the thin blue threads that show streams. I listened to men who had stayed in supply and asked technical questions nobody had thought to ask me at 19. How long had the convoy been stalled? What was the distribution of fuel the day before? Was there any record of German artillery units relocated? The historian's habit of cross-checking served me in one way. It grounded the day as an event among events. It also made the white figure more precisely what it had always been for me, a personal happening lodged in a world that was otherwise legible in facts. The guilt took forms I did not expect. It came in the quietest domestic places. The way my wife's hand would press mine at night, and I would think of a different hand on a different mound. The way my children grew, and I measured their birthdays against the date of the cold in Belgium. I would take my grandchildren to the river and watch them skip stones and feel an absence like a missing tooth. You do not think in metaphysical terms when you are young. Later you will name a conditioned survivor's guilt, but at the time it is only steady pressure in the chest that makes you read obituaries, with a thudding that is partly curiosity and partly dread. I told the story in small doses over the years. To my wife, first of all. To a priest who listened with the face of someone trained in sorrow. To a reunion of veterans where applause bridged the distance between silence and design. Each telling reshaped the memory. That is the queer thing about testimony. You refine it without meaning to. You find new words and angles. You grow more tolerant of listeners' doubts. You also grow more eager to set down the totality of the thing, because you sense the moment when your own voice might be the last that remembers with the kind of detail you value. Retelling led me, at one point in the 1990s, to travel back to the Ardennes. It had been decades since I'd last seen the snowfields where we had staggered. The towns were repaired. Some faces had been replaced by newer ones. I walked the lanes as a tourist in a scene that had once been a life-and-death interest. A local man gave me directions to where a depot had stood, and where, he said, there was still a depression in the field where a crater had been. We walked to the spot and stood in that gentle fold of land. No people remained from our side who had lived that morning. The trees had grown taller, and the roads had been changed. Time had done its work. Standing there, with the wind moving through the underbrush, I imagined the white, again, not as an assurance that would return, but as a private ghost that need not be explained to be loved. I thought of the boy who had asked me whether it was God. I thought of his face, and how it had looked like an open question. I wanted to tell him then, if only to ease his unease, that not all mysteries are cruel, and not all mercies come with invoices. Some things happen, and the job of those who survive is to carry the memory without having to force it into doctrine. People have asked me if I ever came to a conclusion about what the white was. My mind has wandered through labels: miracle, coincidence, angel, mass hallucination, and each label has the inconvenient habit of pushing other possibilities away. So I have stopped insisting on a single explanation. I believe, in a modest, myopic way, that something happened that morning that altered the course of my life. I do not know the metaphysics of it. I do not claim a theological key. I keep my belief like a lighthouse that is useful for navigation, but without the arrogance to command every ship that passes. There are also practical consequences to testimonies like mine. I received an invitation once from a small university to speak at a veteran symposium about the human cost of logistics in war. I spoke about fuel and jerry cans, about abandoned equipment, and the arithmetic of campaigns. At the end I mentioned, briefly and with care, that I had a private perception that I had kept most of my life. A woman in the crowd stood up. She was of my grandchildren's age. She said she had been studying psychology and had written her thesis on the ways people integrate extraordinary events into ordinary lives. She asked if I had ever been embarrassed to share the memory. I admitted I had. She nodded as if my reluctance made sense, and then told me simply that such stories mattered, not because they proved anything, but because they showed how human beings make meaning where none is given. I have held that remark close. I am careful when I speak, because there is an ethical obligation in testimony. If I claim too much, I risk imposing a framework on someone else. If I claim too little, I obscure the gratitude and responsibility I feel. My duty, I have decided, is to be honest about the limits of my language. I tell you precisely what I sensed, and leave the naming to your conscience. I will tell you, plainly, that the memory altered how I prayed and how I loved. It made me less sure of my certainties and more grateful for daily small things. That gratitude changed the shape of my life. After the war, one married and worked in a shop with my hands. I learned to repair things. I built a small life with routine rhythms work, church on Sunday, a garden to coax tomatoes in the summer. I raised children who learned the serious business of kindness. In private, I would sometimes kneel and try to place the morning of December 17th in a context of thanksgiving and sorrow. I would not preach miracles to my neighbors. I would show up when someone was sick. I would share bread with a widow. I would do small errands for an old friend. That was my response to having been spared. It felt like a duty, both light and heavy. Sometimes people ask veterans whether the experience of combat made them bitter or kind. The answer is never simple. The war left a scar that is as much a landscape as a wound. Some days I am tired and sharp in ways I try not to be. Other days the past is a quiet companion that sits beside me as I repair a chair. The presence of that white thing complicates the narrative because it does not obviously resolve into comfort or explanation. It reminds me that life can be both governed by industrial realities and interrupted by the inexplicable. There is also an obligation to the ones who did not return. I think of them often. Names come in waves: Charlie with the missing tooth, Frank with a laugh that sounded like a radio tuning, a boy named Lou who collected stamps and would never build a collection. Their memory is not a prop for my story. It is the reason the story matters. When I speak of being shielded, I never let the sentence stand alone. I must follow it immediately with the faces I carry. Otherwise, it feels like vanity. The truth is that if someone had asked me in that attic whether a single mercy outweighs the lives lost, I could not, in honesty, answer. Mercy is not an arithmetic that cancels sorrow. I have learned, slowly and painfully, that testimony is less about convincing the skeptical than about offering a witness to those who might later need one. There are people who will read or hear my account and be consoled because they too have a small, unaccounted-for moment in their past. There are others who will reject it as fantasy. Both reactions are survivable. The important thing for me is to speak with care and to let the story sit in its own space. If you have stayed with me to this point, you've heard the essentials: the date, the place, the conditions of fuel and the stalled convoy, and the momentary presence of something white that, in the oddest way, made the immediate danger change its mind. I have tried to tell the scene without embellishment. I have tried to keep the memory honest to the sensory facts: the sharp cold, the smell of diesel, the taste of soot in the mouth, the look of men weathered by an instant too many. I have tried not to make the white into an answer. It is not. I have tried to let it remain a testimony, a personal, stubborn fact about my life. So why tell it now, at 88? There are a few reasons. One is the practical. Age makes the telling urgent. Memories fade and voices thin. I want the story in my own words, while the edges of it are still mine to shape. Another reason is ethical. I owe those who did not come home a record that honors their existence beyond the footnotes. Finally, there is a private motive. The narrative of my life knitted itself around that morning. If I misplace the story, it is as if I misplace a limb of my identity. I want the story to sit in the public ledger of memories, where others can touch it, dispute it, or be consoled by it. I will end with what has become for me a small, steady practice. On the anniversary of that day each year, I take a moment to list quietly the names of the men I remember. I do not make grand declarations. I simply say them under my breath. I give thanks in whatever way feels appropriate, sometimes in prayer, sometimes in a letter, sometimes by fixing a chair leg and thinking of a man who could not fix his. Such small acts feel like the only honest pieces of payback I have. If you are moved by this and would like to hear more first-hand recollections, there are maps and documents and names I can share. There is a longer piece in the description that pulls together some of the archival material about fuel logistics in the Ardennes and a few photographs that might help you place the images. Share this with someone who might value a quiet testimony of survival, and leave your thoughts below if you have a moment. I read many of them, and they matter. I am 88. I have lived with the question of why I was spared. I do not have a clean answer. I have a particular nighttime memory, and the weight of it is to make myself accountable to those who are not spared. I cannot explain the white figure any more than I can explain why a particular star is visible on a certain night. I can only say that it existed for me, that it altered the course of my life, and that it left me with a duty to remember, to tell, and to care. If you carry your own unexplainable moment, know this: you are not alone in the strangeness. There are others who carry similar quiet certainties, and our small community is composed not of proclamations, but of ordinary people trying to make sense. I do not offer a doctrine. I offer a witness. Thank you for staying with me. Share this if it moved you. Tell your story when you can. The world will be richer for the listening.